It's truly an honor for me to be able to introduce Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director of Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the OECD. Many of you know Dr. Schleicher because he is also the founder and creator of PISA, the Program for International Student Assessments, and other international instruments that Mario mentioned just a moment ago that have really created a global education platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators across the world to be able to innovate and transform education. So Dr. Schleicher has worked over 20 years with ministries of education from all over the world, and it is truly an honor to be able to have him join us today to present his keynote on the OECD Agenda on Wellbeing and Flourishing. Please, let's give him a big hand.
Hello, and I'm so sorry I cannot join you here in Mexico, one of my favorite destinations. But I'm glad I can contribute some thoughts through this video on this very important topic of human flourishing. You know, the education systems that we have today have created an amazing world. You know, our language, our culture, our economy, our society, our technology, they are all the fruits of education. But that very same education has also left this world with some fundamental disconnects. You know, the disconnect between the infinite growth imperative and the finite resources of our planet, between the financial economy and the real economy, between the wealthy and the poor, between how we measure economic outcomes through our gross domestic product and the sense of well-being of people, between what's technologically possible and the social needs of people, between the way how we govern ourselves and the voicelessness of so many. If we want to see a different world, we need to build different education systems. In the middle of that, you know, the pandemic has shown us how vulnerable our education systems are to even mild disruptions. And the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence, you know, these days puts into question almost anything we took for granted. And you can add so many more disruptors into this equation. Nobody knows what the future will bring, but the more agile we become to understand the different forces that shape this future, the better prepared we will be for the future to come. One thing is clear, you know, global conflict is on the rise, putting more and more tensions into this world, and they all end up on the doorsteps of classrooms. They drive migration, you know, across borders, people seeking asylum, people looking for work in other countries. We see also, you know, rising protectionism. And it's not just a story of, you know, the last couple of years. It's a story that has gone on for quite some time, that we are starting again to build walls between our societies, our economies. We see a decline in the propensity of people to go to vote, to engage themselves in democratic processes. That civic, social participation is often on the retreat. And last but not least, if you ask yourself, you know, what's the biggest health concern today? It's not cancer, it's not stress, it's not obesity. They all exist. But the biggest health concern today is mental health. We see digital addictions on the rise. Smartphone addiction, we all know about it. In every classroom, teachers are aware of this. And technology has also fundamentally changed the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that make us successful. The kind of things that are easy to teach and test are now easy to digitize, to automate. The world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. It rewards you for what you can do with, you know, what you know. Technology-intensive tasks are on the rise. You put the two forces together, you understand the future of work now. If you look to, you know, test scores now, how do humans and artificial intelligence compare these days? Well, you could see one of the first things that we saw, handwriting. Now, artificial intelligence started, in the 90s, 1990s to work on that, and is gradually becoming better than human. And then, speech recognition on a similar path. Now, image recognition, you can say, is now doing a lot better than humans. Now, AI is better in understanding or in recognizing images than humans. Now, reading comprehension. Now, ChatGPT, an incredible kind of pace of changes. Now, language understanding, now, nuanced language interpretation, mathematics, AI is still not as good as human. Mathematics is hard for AI because it involves conceptual understanding, all of that. But as you can see, AI is rapidly moving into the territory that we thought, even a short while ago, to be entirely human. And that pushes us to think so much harder. What makes us human in a world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, have become easy to digitize, to automate now? Now, today, if we ask ourselves, what is education all about? We'll probably have more opinions than we have people in this room now. But maybe, we can agree on a few parameters. I think what everybody would probably agree that is that education should help young people find out, why am I here on this planet? What is important to me? Where can I make a difference now? That sense of meaning making, that sense of purpose. If education can only achieve that, probably we have already achieved a lot now. Helping you find out where you can become really good at. And this is where things already get difficult. Now, this is not just about giving, students lots of choices. Now, choices often, just lead to segregation. No, this is much more about you having a teacher who is not just a good instructor, but also a good coach, a great mentor, an amazing facilitator, a creative designer of innovative learning environments. That teacher role that shifts from, just telling you something to actually helping you find your way, find out where your talents are. But we also know through lots of research that, following your passion will never make you happy. What makes us happy in life is typically, to make a difference to the people around us, to our communities, our societies, to be useful. So helping young people understand, what is this world expecting from me? What does the world need from me? And ultimately, how do you translate better skills into better jobs, better lives? A difficult agenda for education. So what does this mean concretely? Last summer we did something really interesting. In 14 countries, we asked young people, students between the age of 14 and 18, what do you think are the skills that you will need in your future? And the answers were really interesting and quite consistent across countries. When we surveyed, children, we could see that critical thinking and evaluating information came out on top. In this world of artificial intelligence, navigating ambiguity, resolving tensions and dilemmas, finding your own way, figuring out, what's true, what is not true. But think about the second choice here, social skills, working well with others, collaborating with people who are different from me, self-awareness and respect, creativity. So if you look at this list, it's not so similar to what we teach in schools today. And it's a quite different set of priorities that young people see themselves for their future. So how do our education systems currently coming out? Well, when you look at the global PISA rankings, you always see, countries like Singapore or Japan coming out on top when it comes to academic performance. Here, in this case, Japan gets 10 out of 10 points in reading, in math, and science. The students are very, very strong academically. But then, when you look at other dimensions of PISA, you can see Japan has still a lot of work to go. You can see the orange bar is quite short psychological strengths and well-being is not so well developed among Japanese 15-year-olds. No? Agency and engagement, that green bar. No? Can you mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources? Can you do something? No? Once again, this world no longer rewards you just for what you know, but for what you can do with what you know. Putting your ideas into action, taking responsibility, taking initiative. No? And you can see in the case of Japan, that's not a strength of the education system. Or look at the light green by emotional resilience. No? These days, every day you wake up in a different world. Can you adapt? Can you thrive in unforeseen circumstances? No? All I want to show you is, academic success is very important. No? But it's only one of many dimensions. In the case of Japan, the system has done extremely well on academic outcomes, but struggles on other fronts. Let's turn to Mexico. What does PISA say about Mexico? And you can say the yellow bar is very short. You can say, well, Mexico still needs to do a lot of work to raise the academic level of its 15-year-olds. Mathematics, science, reading. Those are important foundations, and Mexico still has a long way to go to reach global standards. But you can see in other areas, Mexico is doing quite well. You can see, for example, Mexican students are quite happy. They are, confident in themselves. They show good level of agency, good level of emotional resilience, strong social relationships. They know how to balance, life with school, with work. So let's not forget about those skills. Now, if you compare Japan and Mexico, you might think, well, maybe we have to make a choice. Either we push kids academically, then they do well in math and science, but end up unhappy and with poor agency and not, emotionally resilient. Or we are like Mexico, we put, focus on the social and emotional development of children and, compromise academic success. But we shouldn't think of those kinds of dichotomies. You can look, for example, at the case of Denmark. Denmark shows us actually you can do pretty well on almost everything. The Danish students are strong academically, they're happy children, great level of agency, good emotional resilience, strong social relationships, and look at the last part. They're open to the world, they appreciate different ways of thinking, open to other cultures, things that are also really important today. So human flourishing really is about, broadening our perspective beyond the academic success towards the kind of outcomes that really matter to build, the kind of humans that can change tomorrow's world. One of the biggest, troubles that we had from our assessment is when we looked at 10 and 15-year-olds. We could see that in every education systems for which we had data, 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. Well, if I would tell you your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would tell me, yeah, you're crazy. That's impossible. The students always learn something in school. No. But maybe not always. No. Maybe sometimes, school takes something away from, children. The compliance-based culture that we have in education, we often still reward answers rather than questions from students. No. I'm a scientist by background, by training, and it sometimes breaks my heart when I see how we teach science like religion. We make children believe in some scientific theory, then we give them lots of exercises to practices, and at the end we test whether they remember our answers. No. That's nothing to do with science. Science is never about reproducing what we know, but putting into question what we know. And here you can see the result. Our education systems are not really doing well to build the kind of creative energy that we need in tomorrow's world. But, where there is a problem, there's also answers. When we ask ourselves, what are the strongest predictors for creative skills? It was not the hours in school. It was the mindset with which young people grow up. You can see, for example, education systems on the right side, which develop a strong growth mindset among young people. the belief that, the sky is the limit. If I invest effort, I trust my teacher to support me, I'm going to be successful. You can see those education systems where teachers convey that growth mindset, they tend to be also the ones where students become creative. And at the left side, you can see education systems, and unfortunately Mexico is among them, where students often believe, success is all about the intelligence I was born with, and there's nothing I can do, so why should I study hard? Now you can see there is a relationship between the mindset that we develop in children and the creative success of our education systems. But it's not the end of the story. We can also see that the attitudes that young people grow up with are very influential now. You have learning environments with more imagination, adventurousness. You see students who are more creative. You have learning environments, teachers, who convey that openness to new ideas, that openness to intellect. You can see the students are more creative. No? Art and experience, Don't treat them as extracurricular subjects. They are the heart of a modern curriculum, and you can see where they are present. Students become more creative. And then, of course, that sense of self-efficacy. You look at this list, it's not so hard to do. Now, human flourishing is not that hard to build. These are very human kind of qualities in the learning environments that, through which we can foster the creative energies of tomorrow. No? Sometimes, school should not be the world of children. The world should be their school. The more we can build connections between the real world and school, the more we will foster those kinds of attitudes that are important. And then, social emotional characteristics. You can see where students are better in taking perspectives, appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of working. They tend to be more creative now. Because creativity often is about trying things differently, looking at things from different angles. Now, curiosity, of course, persistence. Now, innovation is not just about you having a great idea, but you being able to continue to pursue that idea in a very systematic way. Now, resilience to stress, assertiveness, social skills, emotional control. Now, once again, you look at all of this, it's not so difficult to build. Just requires a different approach to education. So let's discuss that. What kind of teachers do we need to build those kinds of learning environments? And I'd like to put, 3 keywords at the center. What do we expect from teachers? First is to be present in the profession, to have that professional identity, to have a strong sense of belonging to my profession, to my colleagues, to the collaborative culture in my school, and then also that sense of becoming, that sense of professional growth that, as a teacher, I am a learner. You can ask yourself, what are the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are needed for that, or the agency that teachers need to bring with them. That individual agency, I can do the things, that co-agency, I work with my colleague, and that collective agency, the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And then if we talk about the well-being of students, we need to think about the well-being of teachers as well. And that's, what's going to help teachers navigate in the world in which we live. Let's have a look at some of those dimensions, and let's start with the easy part, the teacher knowledge and skills that are so important. When we survey teachers in our TALIS survey, what do you think you can do really well? And most teachers said, I know how to teach with clarity, or, I consolidate student work or provide feedback. Those are things that most teachers felt quite comfortable with. But, when you look at the low end, you can see supporting students' social and emotional learning. That's hard for teachers. We don't put as much emphasis on this, but you saw before how important it is to adapt teaching to the different needs of different students. Those things are ones that we can still do better. And when we ask teachers about, their teacher education, unfortunately, in most education systems for which we have comparative data, you can see very clearly that nowadays teachers have a less positive view about their teacher training than they used to have when we did this data collection first in 2018. That's something that we need to change, making teacher education more relevant. And once again, as you saw in the outcomes, you could see that traditional topics like, knowledge of the subjects, pedagogy, they are, quite well incorporated in teacher training. But once again, teaching in multicultural or multilingual settings, or using artificial intelligence, or supporting social emotional learning, those things are much less developed. Why do I highlight those things? Because they really matter. One of the things that we ask ourselves in the PISA study is, what predicts self-directed learning? The learner of the future is not a consumer who just listens to the teacher, but the learner of the future is being able to set their own learning goals, to monitor their learning progress, to take ownership over what they learn and how they learn. That's what you want to see, because that's what lifelong, life-wide learning is about. And you could see what's the most important predictor of that is this quality of student-teacher relationships. Students learn best from teachers they love. So basically building that social fabric is so important. By the way, it is also the most powerful predictor of academic success. Think about student anxiety. The opposite of engagement is anxiety. Some people think anxiety is all about having tough tests or being too demanding to students. That's not what we see in the data. The biggest predictor of student anxiety is a lack of teacher support. And the best predictor for reducing student anxiety is when teachers are supportive. We ask students one simple question. If you come back to your school 3 years from now, do you think your teachers are going to be excited to see you? And when the students say yes, they're not worried. They're actually the motivated, engaged learners. When students say no, lots of worries arise. Not rocket science, actually quite simple to do. Let's move to, the agency part, the level of responsibility. And our data show very clearly for Mexico and most countries that teachers like having autonomy. Teachers, like to be masters of their job, to take responsibility, to make decisions, to have discretion. That's a clear predictor of teacher job satisfaction. Teachers like to take part in school decisions. Very important that leadership today is about, distributed leadership, where leadership is built with the teaching community. Teachers like a collaborative culture. It's not just about autonomy. I do things the way I want them to do, but about I do things in the name of my profession, together with my colleagues. You can very clearly see in most countries, teachers working together is a good predictor for teacher job satisfaction. And the good thing is, teachers are actually cooperating more these days. In most countries, you can see teacher collaboration is increasing. Unfortunately, when you look at this in a little bit more detail, the kind of deep professional collaboration is often quite rare. Collaboration often ends up quite superficial, and teachers just sharing material. So there's a lot that, school leadership, people like you can do to build a true collaborative culture where teachers work on deep professional issues. And last but not least, how can we build a stronger sense of well-being among teachers? Well, first of all, our data actually show that teachers generally are quite happy with their job. In some countries, job satisfaction has increased, in some it's declined, but overall it has remained at a quite good level. Most teachers actually, despite all the difficulties they face, are happy with their job. That's quite amazing. That's quite impressive. What makes teachers happy with their job? Well, I already talked about some things like professional autonomy, a collaborative culture. But, other people might think, well, it's all about money. But, look on the horizontal axis, teacher salaries, and the vertical axis, job satisfaction. You don't actually find much of a relationship between the two. In Austria, teachers are very well paid and very happy. You can understand that. In Latvia, teachers are not very happy and not well paid. Also understandable. But then you have, Romania, where teachers are quite, happy and not so well paid. Or you have the United States, or Australia, or Finland, where teachers are quite well paid and not very happy. So you cannot buy happy teachers. No. the job satisfaction is really the product of the work culture, the work organization of the school, not just, pay. I already highlighted, the relationship with the school principal is so important. The relationship with students is very, very important. And when you ask yourself, what stresses teachers, you can see, well, the work with students actually is not a big stress factor. Now, you add some hours for teaching. Most teachers do not feel very stressed by this. What stresses teachers is the planning, the marking, the bureaucracy, the red tape, the administrative work. Things that teachers do not perceive is really adding to the work, but rather distracting for it. So we want to, make teachers happy. We got to create a work environment that is more built on trust, more built on the quality of relationships, more horizontal in relationships, less vertical, less top down. So those are the kind of things that we can do to build the kind of education systems that will help us, navigate towards that future of human flourishing. Now, building education systems that are not transactional, but that are relational, that place emphasis not just on the cognitive development of students, but on the cognitive, the social, and the emotional characteristics. And you can see some education systems are well on their way. You can see that Mexico already has some very, very important skills or strengths on which it can build for the future. Gracias. Thank you very much.
So now let me formally then just express my gratitude and appreciation on your appearance here today, Dr. Schleicher, and your willingness to join us even if virtually, this conversation to improve not only student performance and academic outcomes, Dr. Schleicher, but also student engagement, overall well-being of our teachers and of the young people in our communities. So thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of Great Place to Study. It is an honor to have you with us. And I'd like to start, if I may, with your comments on if well-being is so strongly connected, Dr. Schleicher, with learning and achievement, why is it that so many education systems are still tend to treat it as an outcome rather than an essential infrastructure for that sustained performance? And what would be your advice to the leaders in the group here today in taking first steps to change that around, to better align it to flourishing and performance?
It's usually hard to improve what you cannot see. And part of with those broader well-being outcomes is often that they do not feature in traditional exams or metrics. And, usually what you measure is where you're going to put your attention, and where your attention is, this is where you see action. And I think that's part of the reason. We just do not look at those kinds of outcomes. The way of, framing education is very much through an academic lens. If you ask employers, they tell you a different story. If you ask, people themselves, they tell you a different story. But, traditional education is very much, focused on formal kind of academic study. And there's also a second dimension. Is often we make the mistake of seeing academic success and student well-being as two opposing ends on a very large spectrum, rather than seeing them as two sides of the same coin. We should not think about how we improve academic outcomes at the expense of student well-being, but through student well-being. But again, to achieve that, we need to have better metrics, better ways to make those outcomes visible, tangible, and therefore valued.
How can technology then strengthen rather than dilute our student-teacher relationships, which are at the core of what you're saying matters most, right? In that learning experience.
Well, don't think of artificial intelligence as some magic power. Artificial intelligence is just an amazing accelerator, an incredible amplifier. It's going to amplify good ideas and good pedagogical practice in the same way it can accelerate poor pedagogy, poor educational practice. It can make, learning more inclusive, more equitable by adapting to the different needs of learners, or it can amplify inequality, super empowering those who have the right skills and disempowering those who don't. Artificial intelligence can, make learning more personal, more granular, more interactive, all those kinds of things. But it can also mislead students to outsource that cognitive struggle that is learning. That's actually one of the greatest risks that we see, that, as humans, it's easy for us to trade in our autonomy for convenience. When we get a shortcut, we use that shortcut. And that's actually the biggest risk of artificial intelligence, that we tend to sort of lose some of our human capabilities. When we started to use Google Maps, we lost our sense of orientation. And I think the risk of artificial intelligence is that we lose our human abilities because we, outsource them. So artificial intelligence should not be a crutch. It should be a scaffold, something that expands our human capabilities, not replaces them. Artificial intelligence, and that's, to your question, can super empower teachers to become the most creative designers of innovative learning environments, or it can disempower them to become the slaves of scripted lesson plans or algorithms they don't understand. Artificial intelligence can moderate the bias of teachers, and let's be honest, every teacher looks at the world from a different perspective. Or it can amplify and entrench the biases that teachers bring into the profession. Artificial intelligence is ethically neutral, but it's always in the hands of people, teachers included, who are not neutral. And I think, that's the way we should be looking at it. The people who decide whether artificial intelligence will be a force for good or, a force that disempowers humans are the people in the classrooms, the teachers in the classrooms. They are the ones who can leverage the potential and mitigate some of the risks.
That was a super packed, full of really great data, information, research, and we are indebted to the OECD and to these great distinguished people that are making such a difference and leaving a great mark in education.